How about a sports analogy?
Those are the best. Intellectuals love sports.
Yeah. You know the idea that they say sometimes about some players in team sports where they're like, every time that person touches the ball, it could be a score. You know, they could score immediately. Every time. Well, I think that for us, at any moment, us Dawdlers in the Dawdlers Philosophy Podcast could go on hiatus at any moment. Anyway, but so it's been a little bit, but we've returned to you now, 12.2 listeners, at the turn of the tide. Not really, but
now there's a reference they might get.
That they might get that one, yeah. So anyway, last December we did an episode on consciousness. It was episode 20, called "The Great Silliness," and we were essentially comparing, contrasting a theory of consciousness called Illusionism with consciousness realism. And in particular, it was a paper by Keith Frankish. I think it was called Illusionism as a Theory of Consciousness. And we tagged Keith in our tweet disseminating it, the episode on Twitter. And he listened. And then he, after listening, responded on Twitter with his own tweet about having listened and what his impressions were. And one of the things he mentioned was wanting to butt in, but he couldn't, because he wasn't talking to us directly. So Harland invited him and invited him on the podcast. And essentially, practically a year later, we're finally here. And so this is an episode where we actually discuss illusionism and other things with Keith Frankish. So without further ado, I am Ryan, back to school night McKenna.
And I'm Harland, set your sights inward, Grant.
And this is the Dawdlers Philosophy Podcast with guest Keith Frankish. Okay, let's go. All right, so essentially this is a continuation from before. We did our own little episode on what we called the Great Silliness, and it was about consciousness and whether or not it exists. And we tagged Keith Frankish, ourselves, in the tweet that we put out, and he listened and he responded, and we had a little bit of a correspondence. One of the things that he had mentioned was he wanted to butt in a lot. And so here we are talking to Keith Frankish finally, after dawdling forever. So welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes. So I'm going to actually hand it over to Harland to kind of begin this, because, really it's the beef, the bone to pick is between you two. So
well, yeah, we'll see. And that hopefully will be interesting and a little bit different than at least some of the other Frankish bits one can find listening around the internet, because in, I think it was episode 20, The Great Silliness was what we titled it, which was a phrase we took from a Galen Strawson paper where he was complaining with those who want to, in one way or another, discount, eliminate, not accept consciousness into their ontology. including prominently the philosophers like Daniel Dennett, the Churchlands, or Frankish. So when you listen to our episode, one of the things you mentioned was it's unusual to be critiqued from the eliminativist side and to be told that you don't go far enough, which I guess is where I was coming from in that episode.
Mhm.
So we'll see if we can. I think we should probably start with a brief. Well, I'd like to hear what your version of the realists' claims are, because the paper that we talked about in that episode was one entitled Illusionism as a Theory of Consciousness. So, please, for our listeners, define consciousness. What is it you're making a theory of?
Right. Yes, good question. Well, I don't think consciousness is one thing. I think the term is used in different ways. And it's confusing. And what some people see as the very heart of consciousness, what consciousness is, other people see as, well, I see as an illusion. So it's not easy to find a common starting point. What are we trying to explain? And the way I like to do it is to just start with some everyday examples. So just look at something around you, or concentrate on something you can hear or smell or feel or taste. Okay, now something's happening there, okay, right? And it's different from what would be happening, say, if you hadn't really noticed that thing. If you had sort of picked up a bit of information about it, say, subliminally. I mean, sometimes things have an effect on us without us really noticing it, unconsciously, we might say. And sometimes they have an effect on us in a rather more conscious way, in a way that we notice. We notice kind of that we're having this experience. The experience is kind of at the forefront of our minds, if you want to say. So if you attend to something, if you attend to, say, a cup in front of you or the color of the wall, then let's say that's a conscious experience, okay? And I think everyone agrees that those things happen, whatever they are, and that they don't happen when you're asleep or when you're unconscious, or if you're really kind of not paying attention, you're just kind of focused on something else. Maybe when you're driving, perhaps you're unconscious. Sometimes if you're engaged in a conversation with your partner in the car, you're maybe taking in information about the road in a sort of unconscious way. Maybe you're still responding to it, but it's not perhaps, I mean, this is controversial, conscious. So take some of these absolutely paradigm examples of what we call conscious experience. When you're attending right now, I'm attending right now to a cup in front of me that is a sort of purple color, and I'm attending to it. Okay, I'm having a conscious experience. I'm happy to say that. Now the question is, what does that involve? Let's say, what does it involve? Well, one thing that involves is that all kinds of signals are coming from my sense organs, from my eyes. Nerve impulses are traveling from my retina along the optic nerve, eventually to the visual cortex at the back of my brain. These signals are being processed by dedicated visual processing areas in my brain, and information about the world is being extracted from them about the color and the distance and the shape of the object. And at higher levels, the object is being classified as a cup, as a solid three-dimensional object, as a cup or whatever. And then that information is being used by other parts of my brain to prepare me to act. If it's a cup full of coffee, and I need a coffee, then I might reach out to drink it, and the information would guide this action, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if it's a snake that I'm aware of, then the reactions will be very different. Now, again, everybody, I think, on all sides of the debate agrees that this is happening when you're having one of these things that we call a conscious experience. But for some people, we haven't really even and we could tell that story in great detail, and this is what neuroscience is trying to do. And I suppose it will take some time before we get the complete picture, but there's no reason to think we can't do this, I suppose. But some people say that in telling all that story, which is all very relevant and interesting, we haven't really yet mentioned consciousness itself, the real heart of consciousness. And this is sometimes called phenomenal consciousness. And this is, the idea is that something else is happening. The brain's doing something else, as well as all that information processing. It's sort of creating a kind of inner experience, a subjective experience. There's something it's like for me to see the cup. It's not just that I get information about the cup and where it is, what size it is, and so on, and that I'm prepared to act on it. I'm also having a subjective experience of the cup. It's like something to see it. There's a kind of inner dimension to all this. And whereas all the other stuff, all the information processing stuff is in principle public, neuroscientists could get in there and start imaging what's happening in my brain. They could and they could start in principle they could discover all about this. They could put electrodes in there and find out which neurons are firing and so on. This subjective aspect is only known to me. Only I really know what it's like to see the cup, what the purple of the cup actually feels like to me. And this is, for many people, when people talk about consciousness, it's this inner subjective side to it that they think is the real the crux of the matter. And consciousness in that sense is what I call an illusion. I don't think there is anything other than all the information processing stuff. And this idea that there is this private subjective world is the illusion. Okay, so that's a fairly simplistic sort of take on it, but I think most people who are realists would accept something like that characterization. There's a good deal of debate as to exactly what you're committed to in being a realist, but I think that broad characterization is fairly accurate. So is that how you understand realism?
I think so. Well, other than the fact that I don't understand it, the way that I characterized it in the previous episode, and still feel the same way even after your turn right here, was that to me it just sounds like a shotgun blast of synonyms that seem to make a sort of really tight semantic circle, that all these things are just defined in terms of themselves and none of them reach out and connect up with any other interesting parts of our intellectual edifice. And I think that if we have a situation like that, that's a problem for the proponent. What do you think about the general metaphysical attitude of the proponent of any ontological posit has the burden to, number one, clearly define what they want me to accept, and then two, to provide arguments to motivate acceptance of it into my ontology?
Now you're putting me in a position, in a very unusual position here, because you're asking me to defend something. I mean, I agree totally with what you just said. So you're putting me in a position of defending something that I've never really tried very hard to defend. So you really should be asking someone like Philip Goff or David Chalmers to defend this. And I probably won't do a very good job, but let me try. Because I think it's important that we understand, and this is one of the aspects of illusionism that makes it perhaps a little bit different from other forms of eliminativism, that I want to try to understand why realism seems so compelling. And in a way, what illusionism is, maybe I'll just say this now, it's kind of eliminativism. I think we should eliminate this notion of the subjective, the essentially subjective, the notion of phenomenal consciousness from our thinking about the mind. But I don't just think we should eliminate it. I think we should take seriously the intuitions that generate that notion. We don't just sort of forget about it. We say, but that picture is a very compelling one. And that fact in itself is a tremendously interesting one about the mind, the fact that it makes this picture so compelling. So I think it's important to understand the intuitions that drive it. Now, in terms of defending it at a philosophical level, I'm not sure that's easy, because I like you, I think that, there should be some traction somewhere with the rest of our picture of the world, and there absolutely isn't, and that's kind of the point. It's essentially subjective. So if it's essentially and this is why I think it's very dangerous, not dangerous, perhaps too that it's seriously misleading, because people go looking for the neural correlates of this. Of consciousness in this sense in the subject, and you cannot find the neural correlates of something that's essentially subjective, because you've no access as a scientist to one of the two things you're trying to correlate. All you can correlate are supposed indications or signs of phenomenal consciousness, or physical observable signs of it, like reports or button presses or something, with stimuli or activity in the brain. So no, you can get absolutely no traction on it. I agree. And that's one reason why I'm suspicious of it. I don't, like Daniel Dennett, I don't believe in the idea of a first-person science that just doesn't in any way sort of what's the word? I want to use the word traction again. That doesn't get any bite with our third-person science. Now, so why are people happy with this? Well, I guess it's a matter, I suppose, of epistemology. They just think that these facts about this subjective realm are presented to them in a peculiarly direct and immediate way. That they don't necessarily, I think, perhaps have to be foundationists, but they think these things are known to them with more certainty than anything else that they know. So we could be living in the matrix. It could be that everything or all our science of the external world is simply science of a simulation rather than of something real. But our experience itself couldn't be a simulation. That is something that is presented to us in the most immediate way. And so they'd say, well, okay, maybe this is kind of metaphysically, problematic, and how do we fit this into the picture of the world that science presents us with? But somehow we've got to do it because it is an irreducible fact about our existence.
But what is their argument or evidence for the existence of this irreducible feature? Because all I ever hear is vehement testimony. But I think most people agree, if you just jump up a level to methodology and ask, is testimony sufficient for ontology? We'll agree that it is not. But then it appears to me that they go on to do it when it's their pet, what they really need emotionally or something to believe in.
Yeah, as I say, I don't have absolutely no brief for them. But let me keep trying to pretend I do. I guess it's interesting. I actually feel a little ashamed. I should have tried to think myself more firmly into this mindset. If you want to criticize the view, you really need to understand it. As I often quote Dan Dennett because I'm a huge admirer of his work. As he says that if you want to criticize someone's view, you should understand it at least as well as they do. I'm paraphrasing, and you should be able to present it to them in such a way that they say, "Wow, I couldn't have expressed it better myself." And only when you've done that are you in a position to criticize it. Okay, so you need to be charitable. You need to take the strongest form of the position. The sort of things you said, I mean, I'm just nodding. I'm just saying, yep. That's exactly why I'm suspicious of this. But let's try to think ourselves into this. Is it hard to think ourselves into it? Isn't it? Well, they might say you don't need to think yourself into it. It's just the default mindset. As soon as you begin perhaps to reflect a little bit, you realize that the world of subjective experience is the only thing you can really be sure of. I mean, you could doubt that there is a world out there. And in fact, science tells us that the world out there isn't the way it seems to us. It seems to me that there are colors painted on the surfaces of things around me. And of course, in a sense, there are. But it seems to me that those colors, as I experience them, the redness of the apple, the blueness of the sky, that these are somehow completely independent of me. And science tells us that that's not really so, because all there are out there are sort of structural features of the surfaces that reflect light of certain wavelengths or whatever. And science doesn't actually find these qualities, the blueness of the blue. But nevertheless, the blueness of the blue is undeniable. If you just stare at something blue, you say, well, there's something there, damn it, that isn't captured by science. The way the blueness, the way it sort of blues at me, this damn it is there. And now science says, okay, it's not really out there. Science doesn't describe the world in terms of these qualitative properties. It seems to be able to do without them, just talks about wavelengths of light and stuff. So what the hell is this blueness? I can't deny its existence. It's there more immediately than anything else. So if it's not actually out there sort of painted on the walls and the cups and the apples and so on, it must be in my mind somehow. And this world of colors and qualities and so on must be a creation of my mind. And then, of course, you get these thought experiments, which you get even quite young children doing these spontaneously. Does the world look the same to other people as it looks to me? If we built a robot that was an exact kind of functional duplicate of me, whose electronic brain did all the information processing that my brain does and responded to things in just the same way, would it actually feel like anything inside? Would it be conscious? Would it have this inner world that I have? What is it like to be a bat? These questions are quite natural ones. I mean, I remember myself at quite an early age, I came up with this idea, exactly the idea that Nagel has in his bat paper, that for something to be conscious, to be a sentient creature, is for it to be like something, to be that creature, for it to have an internal perspective. And I think there's something right about this, something, not in the way that I think it has a certain sort of perspective on things, but let's...
Okay, well, yeah.
So let's concentrate on the blueness of the blue. What are you going to say about that? They say, look, that the blueness of the blue is undeniable. It's just presented to me in a way that I can't escape.
Oh, you're saying that's what we should talk about?
Yeah. I think that's what. So, I remember at a conference when this was being presented, someone just picked up a sheet of bright red paper and just held it in front of another speaker and said, "There, that's what I'm talking about. That redness. That blueness." What do we say about that?
I have not yet appreciated why these sort of Cartesian claims in the stuff like "I think, therefore I am," or "I am incapable of doubting my own existence," or "I cannot deny the redness of the paper," how that is anything other than a commentary on the agent giving the reports. It is a capacity that you lack. You are incapable of doubting it or denying it. Mm-hmm. That doesn't get you to metaphysics. No, that is psychology plus mm-hmm. language plus dispositions. You are this meat pile that tends to report X given stimulus Y, and that isn't metaphysics.
Couldn't agree more. That's exactly what I think is the well, give or take a few tweaks, the right way to think of it. But I think most, certainly my experience of trying to present that kind of view to people is that they say that's very, very, very hard to accept, and that it's as, I mean, I was having an exchange with Philip Goff the other day, and he said that seems to him something like some radical skeptical hypothesis. Like maybe that's what it could be. Maybe it could, perhaps, maybe I shouldn't put this in Philip's mouth because maybe I'm misrepresenting. But anyway, that may be a remote possibility in the way that it's a possibility that we're living in the Matrix, or that the entire universe was created 5 seconds ago. But it's just an extraordinarily implausible one. And certainly this is how people feel about it. That they say what you're doing is you're providing some sort of it just doesn't engage with where they are starting, I guess.
Right. Okay. One of the gimmicks that we've got going on this show is that we've got one host who's kind of coming at it from a philosophy background and one who's coming at it from a quote unquote science background. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to loop Ryan in here, because he makes a comment looking at philosophy from the outside that I have a lot of sympathy for. And he says, yeah, philosophers are lazy, or they don't try hard enough, or they're not, the institution of it isn't hard enough on each other. If I tried to get away with these moves in science, I would be flunked out of the classroom or whatever. So why in philosophy are we so touchy-feely and care what is hard for people? Oh, it's hard. I can't believe that. Well, at work, why do we care? So Ryan, say it in your way, and then.
Oh.
Oh, geez. Now I'm on the spot. I think my biggest issue is that when it comes to something like when I hear someone say my subjective experience is core data, I think that's the Chalmers thing. When it comes to something like science, if you're even just going to do like a survey, you have to have like a data collection model so that you can even answer the question that you're asking, you know. And there's so much infrastructure that gets put into it to at least attempt to limit the amount of biases that you might be bringing into your research, and that's just so hard to do. It's not. It seems simple enough, you know. In practice, it's not. You know, in principle, it you know, that's what motivates us to go out and try and do it, I think. But like, how much failure there is in science, and how much effort there is to just even use the technology or to keep track of all the variables. You know, what it comes down to is you can't have mission creep, and you got to have some kind of version control on everything. And to say something's, you know, core data, but I can't access it, or even if it is just reports, like, well, then those reports, we have to funnel them through something before we can actually start to say, well, we're going to evaluate them in a standardized way to be able to feel somewhat confident about what we're doing. And I guess I watched that thing with you and Richard Brown and Philip Goff, and if I'm paraphrasing this correctly, but at one point Philip said something to the effect of, science doesn't tell us what mass is. And it just, I guess it's a frustrating thing to see that kind of approach, because, you know, what do you mean science or physics doesn't tell us what mass is? That drives me crazy. Like, there's so much work. There's so many people in science who are just right now flunking out of it because it's so hard, and they are trying to get money to, just like everybody else in this world. But in science, there just seems to be this extra layer of, you know, it feels to me like there's this sort of beat down that can happen. And success, that's why I think some of these scientists are so confident, the ones that are the most successful. And I think it's because they're like, thank God it worked. Nothing can compare to the agony of trying to make it work, you know? But that's my approach. That's my perspective on the discussion.
I'm in a strange position here because I'm you know, nodding along to everything you're saying, and I'm trying to put a counter position, playing devil's advocate. Partly, I think, to explain why I want to talk about illusion, because I want to try to not vindicate their intuitions, but take them seriously and explain them. Okay, so I don't trust these intuitions at all. I mean, I kind of have them myself, but I don't trust them about the reality of phenomenal consciousness. And but I take them seriously in the sense I think they're important indications of what's really happening. And they're important psychological data in themselves, the reports, the intuitions. So I do want to take them seriously now, but insofar as I'm trying to put the perspective of the people who believe in them, I'm probably doing a really bad job of that because I've not done it really before. But I think it is important. I think the depth and seriousness of the intuitions, I think, is itself interesting. Now, I suppose the sort of thing they would say to that is, and I think the sort of thing the sort of thing I think they should say is, yeah, sure, all that is absolutely true when you're doing third-person science. Absolutely agree with all that. It's rigorous, it's difficult, it's, you know, it's incredibly hard. We can't trust, you know, we need to, you know, we need to think about bias. We need to do all sorts of stuff. We need to it's really tough stuff. But what they're trying to do isn't science, or at least it shouldn't be. If they are, then they're really on shaky ground. It's kind of metaphysics. Okay, so the idea behind the mass thing, as I understand it, is that science tells us what electrons do. It tells us what mass does. You know, it defines it in dispositional terms, in terms of how these things interact with each other. But then you can ask this question, and I probably like you think it's a misguided question, but it still seems a reasonable one to ask. What really is, you know, an electron in itself? What is the thing that plays these roles, that has these disciplines? What is mass in itself? Okay, so you need to have some sort of notion of the intrinsic nature of the thing, and then the thought is, well, what could this intrinsic nature be? Obviously, science isn't going to tell us about it because science only maps kind of causes and effects and stuff. and interactions and whatever, the structure and the dynamics of the world. What could this absolutely intrinsic nature be? Well, hey, we have an idea of the intrinsic. We have this idea of the intrinsic nature of ourselves, because as well as all the processing and the stuff, the information, but there is this inner aspect to it, and so this gives us a sort of a conception of something that's absolutely intrinsic. And so then you say, well, maybe that's the answer to the other question, and you solve two questions at once. Supposedly, you find the nature of these quiddities, these essential, these intrinsic natures of the ultimate particles, and the nature of consciousness, and you have a sort of an answer to both the questions. I don't buy that, but I think that's an understatement to say I don't buy it. But I think they would say that isn't science itself; it's metaphysics. And you need philosophers to do metaphysics, precisely because it's not science.
You don't think that's, well, this is a little bit vague and we won't go super deep into it because we're talking about consciousness, but don't you think that science is a metaphysics or has a metaphysics?
Yeah, it's certainly, I guess it involves all sorts of metaphysical assumptions, I suppose. But which again, though, I suppose philosophers would say, and that's again why you can't just do science on its own. You need to reflect on the foundational assumptions of it. And again, that's, these aren't part of science. The foundational assumptions of a scientific project are not part of science itself. And I mean, a notion like causation, say, I mean, it's not clear that science is going to explicate that if it's a fundamental notion of science. So again, you need to do some metaphysics of it.
When you say things like we have this certain notion or concept, whatever, I'm hearing anthropology. I still don't get how these people make an ontological argument out of reporting intuitions that they have, or even that a culture has, or even that all of humanity has. This is it's ethology and anthropology. I don't see the philosophy there.
No, well, I think, look, I mean, this is a strange position for me. I think this intuition about the blueness of the blue, the fact that there's a reality to my experience that doesn't seem to be explicable in terms of neurons firing and these sorts of things. That it seems mysterious to us whether a suitably advanced AI would have an inner life. Now, I don't trust those intuitions, but I do have them. I do understand why this seems compelling. And I do also, and I think we should resist those intuitions. I think that we shouldn't trust them, but I do feel the pull of them. And I'm not quite clear whether you guys are really sort of hard-headed science guys, and I'm all for that. But do you not feel these intuitions? Or do you not feel they're as strong as other people? Do you see why some people want to treat them as kind of epistemically basic, that this is a place where we can start? Do you not even feel the pull of that?
In one sense, I do. Like, I'm not one of the, I think the phrase that they sometimes use in literature is, don't feign anesthesia or something.
Right.
In a sense, I get it. But then when asked, in what sense, I would say, what I'm noticing or pointing out or admitting to is a tendency to make certain reports when asked certain questions. I don't think that tendency to make reports or that linguistic disposition indicates the existence of something called an intuition.
Yeah.
To label that as me having and reporting on an intuition is already theory-laden and potentially wrong. And I think that the best theories in this day and age don't include intuitions or, and this is something that I wanted to get into with you, seemings in them.
Oh, right. Okay. So now we may be getting to a bit of a disagreement. I think, of course, I don't mean seemings here in any phenomenal sense or anything like that, and the intuitions or in any phenomenal sense. But I do think there are some sort of more basic well, let's call them judgings or takings or interpretations or something that are maybe at a pre-linguistic level that underlie this. I mean, it seems, could somebody without language feel this way make these judgments. Probably, well, they certainly couldn't make these judgments, I think, and maybe they need a good deal of theory that they only get through language. But I do think there is some. So yes, I mean, look, I think this. I was just going to say something else, so let me say that and then see if it helps. There's I think there's three positions you can take on these assertions that about the fundamentality of the subjective and the phenomenon. One is to say, yeah, I trust it. It's absolute. These assertions are right. It's true. That's foundation, and we've got to accept the truth of it and somehow build it into our picture of the world. The other is to say, it's bunkum. Just check it out. And the third is to say, I think something like this. That's a really interesting fact about human psychology, and it reveals something about the nature of our own access to our own mental processes. That there's something about what we might call introspection, whatever, that's a very broad term here, that that it's not just that we kind of monitor the world, we're in some sense monitoring ourselves. And this monitoring is the basis on which these judgments build. Now, maybe you need some sort of theory as well, but there are some sort of introspective representations there. And when you combine that with a theory, you get this compelling position. It's not just that we've got a bad theory about the mind. And it's not just that we've got we kind of look inside and, as it were, misrepresent ourselves as having these qualities. It's that it's somehow a product of the hardwired access we have to our own mental states and a theory we've applied to that. That's kind of the way I want to see it. So I take the intuitions. Well, you're not happy with the word intuitions, but I take these assertions as a very interesting and perhaps a distinctive fact about human psychology.
When talking about starting points, I think we can, at least the three of us hopefully can agree, that one place that we could start that we all believe in is the reports.
Yep.
The linguistically infected noises made by the agents or in the study or that we're looking at. That's, I think, what I think is the most basic that I'm able and willing to go. And if everyone believes in that, so then I see it as a step further to say, well, those are reports of intuitions / seemings / mental representations. And I'm also interested in what we didn't do a great job, in my opinion, of defining consciousness. It's still just this, here's a bunch of other words. It's what it's like plus subjective and intrinsic. And what's the definition of mental? You say we have mental states or whatever. What's that?
Right. Well, I mean, when I use the term, I simply means I usually use it to mean something like representational. I think I probably use it in a sloppy way, but I certainly don't use it to mean anything that's essentially subjective or anything like that. I don't use it in a way that an artificial intelligence couldn't have mental states. They're, let's say, representational states of some sort. I'm happy with the idea that intentional content is the mark of the mental. But I don't think a lot turns on it. In some cases, you could just substitute neural for mental.
Oh, right, that's exactly what I was just going to ask. And wonder why you don't. And maybe this, I don't know if this is the time, but I guess it's happening. So one of my questions about the papers of yours that I have read and the interviews that I've seen, and why I sometimes feel or wonder if you quote unquote go far enough, in my opinion, is just your rhetoric and vocabulary. Because if when I and Ryan say things, you end up nodding along, it's not obvious to me that that's your position, given the literature, because you are willing to adopt so much of their vocabulary from mental, well, I'm going to keep the word phenomenal, but put quasi in front of it, or I'm going to keep the word seemings or experiences. And you seem to continue to use much of their vocabulary, but then when pressed, you will say, oh yeah, we could just say neural. And if you had said neural in the first place, I'd be on board. But you said mental. Yeah. So how do you decide which vocabulary to use and how to engage rhetorically?
Well, it's picking out, well, one reason I use mental is that it's picking out a certain level of functional organization. I mean, there's all kinds of processes that are neural, but that are not representational, that are not, that you can't capture. And I could say psychological. Psychological would do as well as mental. It's just picking out a certain level of organization, as I see it. I mean, I think of psychology as psychological terms as functional ones, and the same for mental. So I'm just trying to pick out certain high-level states and processes, which are ultimately neural. And now, one reason I do this, I think, look, it'd be great for you guys to have someone like Philip Goff or David Chalmers on, because I get an awful lot of pushback from philosophers on given the way I'm putting it now. Okay, now if I put it in even more reductive terms, I'd have even less success. Now, I really think that what I want to do, what do I want to achieve in philosophy? I want to kill the hard problem. I want to kill it. I want to stop people thinking that it's a problem. The easy problems, as Chalmers defines them, are which are not easy at all, but very, very hard in their own way. Those are the problems of consciousness. Any neuroscientist who thinks there's a hard problem and starts doing research on that basis is wasting their time and their funding, in my view. So I want to kill the hard problem. That's what I want to do. Now, if I sort of just proceed on the basis that, it's meaningless to even imagine there could be a hard problem, I'm not going to get much traction with the people who are committed to it. So I'm using a vocabulary that I hope will, I'm kind of trying to talk, I'm going to talk in their language, but hopefully say clearly enough in that language why I reject their fundamental commitments. That's kind of the aim of it. And if you want to sort of put that in a more hardcore framework, yeah, great, but you're going to find it hard to engage with those people, because they're just going to say they're going to start using words like scientism, and they're going to switch off. They're going to say you're not even taking this seriously.
But what if it doesn't deserve to be taken seriously?
It deserves to be taken seriously because it matters, because it's influencing people, because people are looking for the neural correlates of phenomenal consciousness, and that is a wild goose chase if ever there was one. People are, I don't want to start sort of mentioning names and things, but I think there are huge research projects that are essentially a waste of time. I mean, there's always good stuff that comes out of this. So it's even with that's a bit nasty, and I don't want to shut down anybody's funding or annoy anybody, but because I'm a very ironic kind of fella. But I do think that we're going down a lot of blind alleys, and if you want to convince people of that, you need to kind of show that you understand where they're coming from, that you're not just dismissing them out of hand. And this kind of, I mean, I say I already get enough of these. The silliest view anyone ever. I can't remember the quote now. Silliest thing anyone ever said. I already get enough of that, given where I'm coming from now. And I feel that just kind of Wallace. Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to again. It's that quote from Daniel about showing that you understand where they're coming from, showing that you don't. You understand where their position seems like a convincing one to them. I think if you don't do that, you're just not going to get anywhere. And it matters that we get somewhere on this. It's a bit like, sort of, I guess, I don't know, maybe there's a sort of political analogy or something like that. I don't want to get into politics, but if you really show absolutely no understanding of the other side's concerns whatsoever, then you're not going to persuade them to come over to your side. If you just go, you're just bad people, you're just awful, terrible, can't even talk to you, they're just going to get reinforced in their own position is the danger, because they're just going to close ranks, sort of circle the wagons or whatever it is, and just, stick with their own community. We need to get them out of that and bring them over to this side, so that we can genuinely change things. That's how I see it.
Yeah, I would say, this is Ryan. I would say I think I understand that approach now, because one of the things that I noticed in that conversation you had with Richard Brown
Mm-hmm.
and Philip Goff was that it seemed like two different sports were being played on the same field. And if somebody said, you can't, that's a foul, the other team would be like, what do you mean? That we can do that? It's perfectly fine, you know? And
You know,
if you don't know what the other team is doing, then it's just going to be a lot of balls flying in the air or whatever.
yeah, you've got to sort of infiltrate a bit and try and, blow it up from inside a little bit. It's Dan Dennett's again, I'm mentioning Dan Butcher, notion of chess, which is a game that you play on a chessboard with the chess pieces, but I don't know, that one or two of the rules are different. I don't know, bishops can move in a different way or something.
Right.
Now, chess. Now, there's a massive amount being written about chess, and chess has been studied, and there are books and books of theory and strategy, and it's massive. Nothing's been written about chess. But chess is as intrinsically it's as important as chess, and it's just kind of arbitrary which game we're playing. I guess that's a temptation. I'm tempted to see some philosophy like that. It's just it's just a game with arbitrary rules. But it's a game that's got a lot of influence at the moment, and I think this and within philosophy of mind, and also with to some extent within the neuroscience community, notions like property dualist notions, even panpsychist notions, are getting some influence, and there seems to be a certain revival. There seems to be a revival of panpsychism at the moment, and I think we need to understand why that is, and kind of show people a path from their starting point. Well, perhaps not from their very starting point, but from things that they do. Telling them that your starting point is just obviously wrong isn't going to do it. You've got to say, look, I see why that starting point is so massively persuasive to you, and I'm going to try and explain that. I'm going to try to help you see why that's a incredibly compelling illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. Now, if you just go, well, there's nothing more than the reports, and that's it. They're not even going to listen.
That might be, well, it's definitely more the case for old folks, right, than developing youth. So what if
is that true?
Well, I don't know. You think not?
I don't know. I know. I genuinely don't know. I mean, there seem to be quite a few young and up and coming panpsychists around. I mean, certainly Philip and Sam Coleman and people like this. They're younger than me. So.
Oh, I'm talking about kindergartners or what. As we're just getting started. So maybe I'm wrong that this is in large part the attitude of the institution, the academic institution of science, but won't they be more dismissive? They'll just say, no, I know that you maybe think that you're doing science, you're doing it wrong. You need to learn how to do it right. They don't take whatever's kindergarten epistemology they have developed seriously and get down on their knees and talk to them in their own terms. Oh, Timmy, well, I understand that you think you have qualia, but why not just say, you haven't even met step one. You haven't defined your terms and motivated you have no arguments, and you're just doing this wrong, and be a little harder on them. Might that not be a better political decision if the goal is to change minds?
Look, I've no objection to people trying that. I'm a sort of ironic guy. I don't want to fight. I want to try and persuade. Now, if you guys want to, go out there on the streets, I mean, go for it. I mean, we need all approaches. I do think this matters. I think it's seriously distorting our understanding of ourselves, and so go for it. I don't think there's only one way to fight this fight, and if that's how you guys want to do it, great. But I would also say one thing: I don't think scientists are as innocent on this as you might think. I think that dualistic, not substance dualistic, but property dualistic assumptions are common within science. Perhaps not so, well, I don't know. I mean, the whole search for the neural correlates of consciousness, what's that about? Now, if you're searching for the neural correlates of some sort of perceptual discrimination, yeah, fine, you can do that. Or some sort of reaction, you can do that. If you're searching for the neural correlates of the subjective feel, I am never going to do that. That's just it's impossible in principle. Because
would you say that's an analogous move to looking for the atomic or molecular correlate of caloric fluid?
Would I say that it's not at all, because you can get a grip on these things through observation and experiment. You know, theory informed. You can't get a grip on the essentially subjective through theory and experiment. No, it totally escapes the causal nexus. So there's no way you can. It's a non-science project.
I might have misspoke, but I was attempting to appeal to one of those standard examples like the ether or the things that we talk about in the pessimistic meta-induction arguments about science used to believe in this thing and it no longer does. So, you know, I'm told we used to think that heat came from this caloric fluid or something, but now we think of it as molecular kinetic energy or whatever. So I was saying, is searching for the neural correlate of consciousness analogous to searching for the chemical correlate of caloric fluid, something that we no longer think? No, you don't think so?
It's definitely not. Not if it's good. Not if what you're searching for is the neural correlate of phenomenal consciousness, essentially subjective stuff. Absolutely not, because you've no third-person grip on it at all. Theory, experiment, nothing is observation. Nothing is going to give you a grip on it. You can look for are correlates of some kind of supposed putative indications of it. You know, that the subject can do this or that if they're conscious, and you can look for that. You can correlate that. You can't. If it's essentially subjective, you're never going to be. I mean, we might be able to kind of eliminate it, but that will be on the basis of these wider sort of theoretical considerations about we're not taking these intuitions seriously. But if people are taking those intuitions serious, and then they're looking for the neural correlates of this thing, then it's a complete wild goose chase. And yet there are scientists doing that.
How about the architectural correlate of ghosts? Like that which goes bump in the night and all the creaks and noises or whatever, and then we go looking around for the ghosts that caused it when we have good reason to believe that it was just the wood in the walls, or what? Is that a better analogy?
You can look for the architectural correlates of the indications of ghosts, and for the indications of contrary, you can't look for them. If ghosts are not, you know, you can posit ghosts. I mean, if you want to believe in ghosts, there's no way science can stop you, because you can just say they're completely unobservable, undetectable. Maybe I have some sort of intuition that they're present. Maybe I know when there's a ghost there, even though science can't pick it up. You can say that, and that's exactly the case with consciousness.
Okay.
I mean, I sound like I'm the hard-nosed science guy now. What's going on?
No. I'm trying to agree with you, and I'm trying to make parodies of how bad this movie is.
Right. Sorry.
I'm trying to be.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So but you're kind of doing the thing okay, all right. Yeah, fair enough. No,
looking
exactly.
for consciousness is as bad as, or maybe even worse than looking for ghosts.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, of course, you could say that ghosts are just sort of peculiar kind of reactions we have to certain creepy kind of situations. Yeah, then they're fine. That's no problem. We could say that consciousness, when we talk about consciousness, we don't have to say that there's nothing at all going on. Of course, these reports that we issue are not just issued randomly. You know, they're indications of something happening. It's not anything it's not what we think's happening, but something's going to make the report. This is why I use the word quasi-phenomenal. Or we could say pseudo-phenomenal might be better, I think. There's something happening. Some neural processes are happening that, you know, that cause the reports, and the reports are kind of reliably correlated with something or other happening, but not something essentially subjective, something phenomenal or whatever. And again, you know, ghost reports are reliably, I guess, well, maybe they are, but they could be reliably correlated with, I don't know, squeaky woodwork or something. I don't know what and we can find that, and there's no problem there. But the reason I sort of got into about neural correlates is that you were kind of talking as if scientists were sort of like, you know, the good guys and philosophers the bad guys. I think there's a lot of bad philosophy assumed by people who are doing science of consciousness. So I don't think it's just a matter of saying you leave it to the scientists. I think scientists are susceptible to one of the people who really worry me are the people who claim not to believe in this kind of stuff, claim to be physicalists, but still have, can't really exorcise these demons. They still have these assumptions, and which show up in various ways. What Dan Dennett calls the Cartesian materialists, and I think they are. A lot of philosophers think they're thoroughgoing physicalists, but they still say, but there's still something it's like, of course, to be as. Of course, there's something it's like to be as, and we need to explain that. What I call, diet qualia, sort of not the full-blown qualia that Dan Dennett attacked in his famous paper, but some sort of watered-down version of it. I don't think you can have that at all. I think that's it's like being a little bit pregnant. It just doesn't. It just
Yeah.
You can't be a kind of state that's a little bit essentially subjective. And if it's not essentially, sorry.
No, I think the one thing that I tend to repeat along these episodes is that science, at some point, kind of got away from advancements in philosophy or even working with philosophers, and what they've become really good at, because there's been some success, with like R.A. Fisher and, Pearson and all that, is philosophy of statistics. And I think a lot of scientists focus much of their energy now on that. And of course, the numerical aspect of science and whatnot. And when it comes to just having a metaphysics or whatever it is that they would have, they've got a lot to work, a lot of work to do. So it's just I kind of think, for instance, a lot of them are still very much, in a way, logical positivists and stuff like that. Everything's, they really believe in falsification, and they also want to let the data speak for itself, and that kind of stuff. So that you're right. But at the same time, they at least have that philosophy of statistics that helps.
I agree. No, I do think science needs philosophy, good philosophy. I mean, there are a lot of people now in the philosophy of mind, or they might not even call themselves philosophers of mind, philosophers of psychology, philosophers of cognitive science, who are essentially doing sort of very broad brush theorizing based on empirical work. And I think that's really important. And it's often quite difficult for people like Peter Carruthers, for example, who was my supervisor. I don't know if you know his work, doing great stuff, I think. Now, I think it's very important that we do this broad brush theorizing that kind of tries to draw together a lot of empirical data, maybe from different areas, and tries to see how it all kind of fits together and to try and get a general idea of what's going on. And often scientists are discouraged from doing that. Stick to the data, stick to and it looks a bit kind of amateurish to do this. And philosophers have a license to speculate. So I think that they're licensed fools. And so there's I think we can contribute a lot in that way, provided we are ultimately led by the data, and we don't go off on these sort of metaphysical flights of fancy. So I actually, in a way, philosophy of mind kind of does bifurcate between people who see themselves as primarily doing sort of metaphysics of mind or something like that, and philosophers who see themselves as doing very theoretical psychology, or even very theoretical neuroscience. And with that, I'm firmly on the side of the latter. But I guess in my work on consciousness, though, I've been more trying to engage with the other people and trying to precisely because I think that metaphysical project is causing it's causing a lot of disruption, I think, to the science of consciousness at any rate.
Right. It's the outreach.
Yeah, I'm not going to sort of name particular research projects, but there are some that I think are good. I mean, okay, integrated information theory, I think is a project.
Making news.
That's going nowhere quite fast.
Okay. All right. What? Any others? Now that we got you going.
No, I'm not gonna do this here because I'm a nice guy. But I think it wouldn't be too hard to extrapolate from what I've said. So I'll let people draw their own conclusions on that.
Right. Yeah. The one thing that I have is, and since I'm on the outside, I'm kind of wondering, because I don't know the literature as well with respect to philosophy of mind and consciousness studies.
Mm-hmm.
What about the binding problem, and what do realists, for instance, often say about that, and why isn't that a possible solution to the hard problem? Even, whatever the solution for, say, something like feature binding, why wouldn't that be a solution for the hard problem? And I know hard problems got the subjective feels and all that, and the first person component. But what if you could explain first person stuff?
Well, hang on. I mean, what do you mean by explain first person stuff? If you can explain, I mean, you didn't like my word intuition, but let's say judgments. If you can explain our first person judgments, hey, it seems to me like this. It seems to me like there's this kind of rich, integrated world of awareness here, that it's sort of that I have this field of vision, and that it's rich and detailed right out to the extreme, and it's everything's, all the different features of the world are all kind of bound together into solid objects around me, and that the other modalities are also integrated into it nicely, so the sound's coming from the right place or whatever. Yeah, and the touch is also integrated with the way I see things and so on. That's how it seems. Now, all those judgments about that, they all need explaining. I think everybody agrees they need explaining. And realists, I assume, would say, yeah, we've got to explain those judgments. And maybe that can all be done in terms of stuff that's going on in the brain. But we've also got to explain the first person reality of it all, the fact that it is like that. Now, the illusionist project, I guess, is to try and say, look, try and explain the first thing, all your judgments about this, and then see that you don't then need to vindicate those judgments. So maybe something like, solving the binding problem insofar as it is a problem. I'm not sure how much it is a problem. I don't know. They need to be coordinated rather than bound, I would have thought. But anyway, let's say that solving those first kind of problems, explaining why we judge that it's this way, might then help to dispel the second problem, so that we don't have to then any longer trust that it is that way, because we would think that it was that way anyway.
Yeah,
even if it wasn't. That's the idea. Do you know David Chalmers' paper, the meta problem, which is the problem of explaining why we think there's a hard problem, and he thinks that can probably be explained in purely physical terms, in terms of brain processes. The brain processes can explain why we judge that we have this inner world of experience and the subjective experience, and that there's a hard problem of explaining. He thinks all that can probably be explained in terms of processes in the brain. Nevertheless, he thinks there is such an internal inner world, and there is a problem of explaining it. But of course, the illusionist just says, once we've done the first thing, once we've explained our judgments about it, we just stop and say, that's all. We think this anyway. So why trust it? We've debunked it.
Isn't that appeal evidence against your rhetorical strategy? Because he's telling you right now, even if you succeed, Professor Frankish, and do all that you've succeeded with all your easy problems, I'm still going to believe in this. Doesn't even matter.
Have a look at the paper, because I think David says that if he weren't a phenomenal realist, he would be an illusionist. He thinks if he were a physicalist, he'd be an illusionist. And there's a dialogue at the end of that paper between the illusion that he constructs between the illusionist and the realist. And as he admits himself, the illusionist does seem to have some of the more interesting moves in that debate. So, I mean, what it kind of brings out nicely, I think, is that these intuitions, these judgments, these reports of how it seems to me have really no evidential weight at all. There is just table banging at the end of the day that damn it, it still is real. And I think having that explanation of the judgments, being able to discount the judgments and just leaving it to pure table banging, which of course is itself explicable in terms of the neural processes. I think it highlights the dialectic in a really, really sharp way. And I think once that sort of really sinks in with people, then I think that's the best way of getting them to let go of the. We may still have some sort of strong disposition to, just as we have a strong disposition to judge that the lines in the Muller-Lyer illusion are not the same length, and that disposition doesn't go away even when you've convinced yourself that they are the same length. The disposition's still there. There's still kind of like some sort of a bunch of neurons in your head telling you to say they're different. And I think that's how it will be with consciousness. We'll still say, damn it, there's blueness. There's blueness. The blueness is here, right at me. We'll still have that. But maybe we'll just go, yeah, but that's don't trust it. That's just your.
I think we will, if I use this vocabulary, it will seem the same the next morning after you have your illusionist epiphany and stop being a realist. It will still seem the same to you in the morning, but I wonder if it will seem the same after 10 generations and after the English language kind of morphs around the new theory and people grow up in the new cultural and linguistic milieu. Maybe it won't seem the same anymore.
That's a lovely point. I mean, I think there are two elements to this illusion. Let's just use my terms for the moment. I think there's something about the hardwired nature of introspection. There's some hardwired element to this. It's not just that we've kind of just invented the story about ourselves without any basis to build it on. There's something about the nature of our introspective axis that makes this a very attractive story for humans to tell about themselves. And then there's the story that we tell. Now, I don't think we're going to, without sort of serious kind of genetic engineering or something, we're not going to change the first aspect, but we can tell a different story. And we can try and develop ways of reinterpreting what introspection is telling us, or what dispositions introspection, what our introspective dispositions are. We can build another story around them. And arguably humans have done this. And people who know a lot more about Buddhist philosophy than I do tell me that there are Buddhist stories that are perfectly in line with the illusionist perspective. So I'm sure we can do this. And just as we can tell stories about free will that capture all that's important about it, I suppose, if anything is, without endorsing its reality. So yes, I think that's right, and I think we should start trying to do it, because there are a lot of philosophers just kind of digging into the old picture and just sort of insisting we can't give up on it. And let's try. Let's see what we can do. Again, I'm quoting Eliminativism. He says, if you say you can't imagine something, you can't imagine how something could be the case. Well, try harder. And this may be a process of building a story that we can. Yeah, and it's a very important story because it's a story about our place in the world. Panpsychism, it gives us an extraordinary place in the world. It says that the kind of the stuff our minds are made of is, in a sense, the very stuff that the universe is made. Well, physics says that. It says that our minds give us an insight. Our introspective abilities give us an insight into the fundamental nature of reality. When you reflect on your own mind, that gives you access to the very nature of matter itself. That's an extraordinary claim. It's very anthropocentric. So now, I know Philip thinks that panpsychism has some rather benign metaphysical consequences. I think in a way he's right, because one thing it does say is that there's no sharp dividing line between us and the rest of nature. If all of nature is kind of infused with consciousness, then we are not special. We are not, the ones with the sort of with the soul and the God-given abilities or whatever that separate us from the rest of nature. And I like that. And of course, the illusionist says exactly the same, that there isn't this sort of inner, I can't remember what word I used now, but the consciousness is nowhere. So we're on exactly the same level as the rest of nature. So sorry, I've lost where I was going with this, but I do think these stories we tell have important implications for how we live. So they're not just a philosophical matter. It's not just a theoretical matter.
I've often disliked the way people employ the word just in both senses, because I don't believe in justice, but that it's this kind of dismissive, mere philosophy. Well, that's just theory, and it's not relevant. I think probably everything is relevant if our behaviors are influenced by our epistemology, and our epistemology is influenced by our theories. Then it's not just theory; it changes everything.
Exactly. I think it's just theory.
One of the things that I wanted to get out of this, and I think I have, so I just want to check to confirm, is sort of a short part one. Is illusionism eliminativist, but just plus a positive program? But it does want to eliminate phenomenal consciousness, if that's the phrase we use.
Yes, 100%.
Okay, so that's good. So I think that between you and I, to the extent I matter, the differences are primarily rhetorical and not substantive. It's mostly just the way that you choose to go about the, if we use a militaristic metaphor, the attack, or the undermining, the attempt to persuade people out of the hard problem and stop wasting their money and careers.
Yep. In the course of the last hour talking to you, I've not found anything that gives me reason to think that that's not the case, that there is any deeper. I mean, I'm sure that we'd find we'd find relatively minor things to differ over, but in terms of basic commitments, I'm with you.
Okay, so let me throw out one example of how I might do it differently, rhetorically, this attempt to argue them out of their position and see what you think of it. When we encounter the popular phrase, what it's like, or what it's likeness, you engage with that by saying, well, sure, there's something it's like, but let me actually double down on it and make a what it's like too. And I'm going to change the definition a little bit, and it's like something in this way. And this is, again, what Dennett does with everything. Well, let me change the notion of free will so that you can keep it. And I've never liked that. What I would want to do about what its likeness is say, that is not semantically useful. You cannot do this as a defining activity. You're not defining anything. What you have done when you've attempted to define consciousness by what its likeness is given me a poetry assignment, quite literally. Everything is like everything else in some respect or other, and different from everything else in some respect or other. Otherwise, they wouldn't both be things, and there wouldn't be two of them. So, given enough ingenuity on the part of the poet, everything is like everything else. And if you say, describe your experience of phenomenal blueness when looking at the sky, tell me what that's like. It's a representational project, as you would put it. You're asking me to put into words, but you're giving me a writing assignment. I don't see how that helps anybody. And that I would just go right at it and say, stop using that as an attempt at a definition, because it's not.
I certainly agree it's not a definition. I think there's something here that is worth talking about, and that is, kind of what I'm sensitive to and what it means for me. There are certain things in the world, describing what Dennett or Sellers would call a manifest image. The things in the world we're sensitive to and the impact they make on us. So I'm sensitive to certain kind of wavelengths of light and not others. I'm sensitive to certain chemicals in my food and not others. I'm sensitive to certain sounds and not others, and so on and so on. And they have significance for me. They mean something. They prime me to react, sometimes very quickly. And we can map this. This is kind of doing what Nagel called objective phenomenology, which is kind of describing the significance of stimuli for us, what they mean for us. And this is, I think, this is a perfectly tractable scientific project. There's no problem about this at all. We just have to sort of map up, reactions to stimuli, and it's an incredibly complicated one because the reaction is multi-dimensional. There's affective reactions, and there's associations, and there's all kinds of stuff that we need to factor into this, and it will be very. Now, and in a sense, I think that's, you could say what we're doing there is mapping what the world is like for us, and what the world is like for me is different from what the world is like for a dog, because it's got a different range of sensitivities and reactive dispositions and so on, and we can map that. And I mean, again, strategically, I'm sort of trying to say to people, look, you do want to talk about something here, and yeah, talk about that, and attach all your sort of intuitions about what it's like to that stuff. And then, you don't just sort of say, just chuck them out, just ignore them, because they've got a grip on it, but give them something to latch, something better to latch those intuitions onto, which is a kind of, I guess, what Dennett does with free will. He says talk about autonomy instead, which is a much more tractable notion, and latch your intuitions onto that. But actually, I think you'll find that in general, I mean, I agree that I've been ambivalent about this, but in general, I do tend to resist offering a kind of realist language in which to put my view, precisely because I want to confront people with the need to give up on phenomenal consciousness. So I think actually you'll find people who have a view quite similar to mine, but tend to cast it in realist terms, precisely because they want to just make a smooth transition between people's commitments. And I think I'm probably a bit more hard-headed about this than most people. But yeah, I'm honestly not sure what's the best strategy, but I think that's a reasonable way to, rather than just asking people to simply sort of get off that wagon altogether, maybe just steer it in a different direction, something like that. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Your strategy seems to me emphasizes the quasi-phenomenal properties. You're saying attend carefully to those and report on them to me.
No. You can't attend to those. The quasi-phenomenal properties are the properties that cause your reports. You don't necessarily know what they are. You think, I mean, naive realist thinks they are just what the reports say they are. That there's phenomenal blueness. No, it's not phenomenal blueness. What is it? God knows. It's some kind of, some sort of complex of representational reactive states, I suppose. That's for science to tell you what the quasi-phenomenal. You can't just attend to this. What you can do is, sort of try and make your reports as careful as you can, given the way that you normally make them, whatever that is. And that provides us interesting, useful data for trying to track down what's the real cause of them. It's like saying, if you say I'm sensitive to ghosts. Okay, tell me all about your sensitivities. What does it do? It makes sure, is it primarily oral? Is it visual? Is it tactile? Is it the skin conductivity? What is it that makes you think there's a ghost there? We can map all that, and then maybe we can track down what is actually causing them to report this. And maybe it's to do with something in the atmosphere, to do with sounds, to do with whatever. So we need to get them to do this, what Dennett calls heterophenomenology. We need them to elaborate these reports, but then we can tell them what you're actually tracking there is something quite different from what you think you're tracking.
So what if I put it this way? You're asking them to turn inward. Is that allowed?
Well, not necessarily turning. I mean, just just asking them to say, to produce whatever. I mean, yes, they can. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly part of what that would be an interesting thing for them to do. How does it seem to you? To describe the nature of their experience, which might be put in terms of the external world, or in terms of impressions of the external world, I suppose.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to emphasize is I want them to turn outward at least to the extent that, as you just said, put it in terms. Okay, put it in terms. Mm-hmm. That's language. Let's concentrate on the language more than on how things seem to you. What do you feel like saying? And then we're going to be looking outward at the. That's what
I mean by seeming. Seeming doesn't here mean certainly not in any phenomenal sense. It's not what you're disposed to say, what you're disposed to judge. Perhaps maybe you could judge it without expressing the judgment, but essentially, what you're inclined to think and say.
I'm just trying to get at there might be a difference in the way that we talk about that. Might either reinforce their phenomenal realism, because if they look inside, they're looking at that blueness and they're like, oh, what do I feel like saying about this? Whereas if you come at them from another angle with a different rhetoric, it might get them to turn outward at the language and say, "Ooh, I'm this weird biological computer that's been programmed with linguistic dispositions. Let's look at the structural metaphysics of English instead of let's look at the blueness in my brain, in my mind."
Yeah, but I mean, you're not going to get them away from the intuition that their brain is contributing to the nature of the judgment, because it certainly is. I mean, people who are colorblind give different reports, so there's certainly some internal processes that are, making a difference here. It's not that it's not just that we've mastered different vocabularies. There are reasons why we apply these vocabularies in certain ways. I mean, that's a psychological process or a neuroscientific project.
Mm-hmm. You got any wrap-up points?
Well, no, nothing to wrap up. Just maybe we could do this again sometime, because I'm also interested in the kind of the history of consciousness research and thoughts, as well as other kinds of ways that one can talk about consciousness.
Yes,
yes. I rarely see any mention of evolution.
Yeah.
And I know it's out there and people talk about it to an extent, but we're often quite presentists when we approach this problem. And I understand why, but it'd be fun to explore the more historical, both in an anthropological way, but also in an evolutionary way. Anyway,
do you mean the evolution of the thinking about consciousness, or the evolution of consciousness itself?
Well, the evolutionary approaches in a biological sense. Yeah. Right. The evolution of consciousness. Yeah. I mean, we talk about that, but the three of us might have a hard time just because it's not our wheelhouse.
Well, I mean, do you know Nick Humphrey's work? For instance, Nicholas Humphrey, Soul Dust, for instance, it's a book I like a lot. It's an illusionist story, and it's an evolutionary story about the illusion. The idea is that the illusion is not just a kind of a bug; it's a feature. It's a really highly adaptive to think of ourselves as being special in this way, as having this kind of inner world, this soul, as it were, not a metaphysically, not an actual soul, but the illusion of a soul. And he tells he is an evolutionary biologist, and he has a really interesting story about the origins of this in a very primitive sensory system that is separate from the perceptual system. And he's got a really, really interesting evolutionary story about that. Now, I don't know whether it's right. I like the story. And it's certainly an interesting way that you can go on thinking about the evolution of consciousness once you give up these realist assumptions.
Yeah. Okay. I'll definitely look into it.
I like the book. One thing that's nice about it is that he writes with, I mean, yes, you might not like this, you guys, but he writes with, he draws on poetry and literature and music and art and so on. So he's the opposite. He gives the opposite impression to someone who's a scientist, a scientific perspective on this. It's he really relishes consciousness, and he relishes he sort of celebrates the potency and power of consciousness while conceiving of it as an evolved illusion.
Okay. Cool.
You have any final words or any questions for us or anything over there?
No.
I'd like. Oh, sorry. Was that to me?
No, that was going across the pond. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to see you guys talk to a committed realist. Get Philip on and
yeah.
Well, I've got some sympathy for panpsychism. Let me tell you why. So if I don't want to run over too much, but if you're going to trust those intuitions, and you really want to hang on to the reality of phenomenal consciousness, then burying it away there, right, sort of in the sort of hidden away behind this veil of subjectivity, is, you know, and putting it right in the heart of matter itself, is kind of a nice thing to do, because it doesn't interfere with anything. You don't have any interactions. You don't have any questions about when it pops into existence. You know, where does the light come on? It's on everywhere. And kind of a light that's on everywhere is kind of, well, not much difference to a light that's on nowhere. I mean, the light that's on everywhere but doesn't do anything, doesn't illuminate anything, or a light that's just not on at all, well, empirically, there's absolutely no difference between them. So, you know, sort of shielding it away in that way, I kind of think, yeah, you know, okay, cool. Yeah, then you have your intuitions and it doesn't change anything.
Well, other than that, you've asked me to now include a massive universal metaphysical baggage into my model that I don't want in there. So I agree that I like the flatness of it, and that we're not special or different.
Yeah, but it's one that you can completely ignore for every practical purpose. All it does is underline your intuitions, but it doesn't underwrite your intuitions, but it doesn't make any difference to anything at all. So if you want to have it, you know, at least it's not going to distort your science, because you're not going to try. There's no way you can do science on it. So science just continues just the same as before. Look, one thing that's come out of this, and I think that's interesting, is that it would be really good to have some research on people's intuitions about consciousness, and on how they can be, I was going to say manipulated, that's not word, massaged, influenced, shaped, how stories we tell and questions we ask and intuition pumps we create can shape the way that we think of our own minds. And I think that's a very interesting project, and I'm not sure that a lot of work has been done on that. And yeah, I think that's what I would, you know, I'd want to see that as part of the project that I'm engaged in.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds good.
All right, but Harlan's looking at me like, I think this is enough.
Okay, there.
All right, well, thank you so much. You know, we hope to do this again sometime.
Yeah, thanks. It was fun. It was. Are we finished recording now?
I will.
Oh, it's optional. If you have, we can edit in if there's any more to say, or we can stop now.
No, it was fun. I mean, it was fun being pushed to try to articulate the other side's position in this. And I mean, one reason I would like you to talk to a committed realist is to make sure that they have chance to speak for themselves. I mean, I'm not going to give the best presentation there, and I think you maybe underestimate the existence.